tell me the difference. Okay. The same way I check my front suspension, the same way I check the rear suspension. The only difference is that I have an airbag. That the airbag is not cracked, that is not leaking, that is properly mounted to the frame. Okay? If the examiner tells you no, that he wants to hear everything, or she wants to hear everything, then you talk about the suspension. Okay. I'm checking the spring mounts, make sure the spring mounts are not cracked or broken, that they're properly mounted to the frame. Checking the bushings, make sure they're not torn or cracked or missing. Checking the leaf springs, make sure the leaf springs are not cracked or broken, and that it has no illegal weldings. Checking the U-bolts. Checking the U-bolts, make sure the U-bolts are not cracked or broken, that they're properly mounted tight. Checking the shock absorber. Make sure the shock absorber is not hanging, that it's not cracked or broken, properly mounted, that the bushings are not torn or missing. Airbag, no cracks, no leaks, that it's properly mounted to the frame. Okay, now we come to our brake section. Okay, also on the brake section on the rear tractor, we do have a difference here. Okay, like I said, when you come to the brakes, you want to ask the examiner, him or her, or may I tell you the difference, sir or ma'am? And they say yes. Well, then you say, okay. The same way I check my front brakes, same way I check the rear brakes. Now the only difference is that I have 2 brake hoses, 2 brake chambers, and they're spring brakes. One hose is for emergency, one hose is for service. We're making sure that the hoses and chambers are not cracked or leaking, and they're properly mounted, and they're spring brakes. The spring is inside the chamber that separates them both. Okay? But remember, if the examiner wants you to say everything, if you say Munoz, go ahead and just tell me everything about the brake system. And I say, okay. And then I'll just talk about then making sure the brake hoses are not cracked or leaking, that they're properly mounted, checking the brake chambers, make sure they're not cracked or leaking, and they're also properly mounted. Checking the slack adjuster, make sure it's not cracked or broken, there should be at a 90-degree angle, cotter pins are not missing. Push rod should have no more than 1-inch play, but to adjust these brakes, I will park my truck on level ground. I will chock the wheels. I will go to the cab, fill the pressure up to maximum. Once I do that, I release my brakes, come back down and mark my push rod. Once I mark the push rod, I will go back to the cab, set my brakes, come back down to the push rod. I should have no more than 2-inch play. So to adjust these brakes, I will go back to the cab, release my brakes, come back down with the 9/16, turn it clockwise tight, open it back a quarter. Brake drum. Should have no oil, no grease, and no cracks. Brake shoes, no less than a quarter. So remember, you do have a difference on the brake system. You are allowed to ask them, but you have to ask them to say the differences. If they say no, then you would tell them everything, because you already told them everything in the front, you would tell them everything in the back. But if it lets you say the difference, go for it, say the difference. Okay, now we come to the tires. Okay, now we have 2 sets of tires, 2 sets of rims, 2 sets of valve stems. Okay, now these 2 tires, the inflation of these 2 tires should be from 90 to 105 or manufacturer recommended. The condition of these tires should have no cuts, bubbles, or nails. Now the depth changes to 232 seconds, and these tires are permitted to be recapped. Checking the spacers. This truck doesn't have spacers, but DMV wants us to talk about it. So let's assume there's spacers in there. We check them every 2 hours or 100 miles for cracks and looseness. I should have no trash or debris between my tires and rims. Okay, the two rims should have no cracks, no illegal weldings. I have two valve stems. They should not be touching the rim or leaking any air. The lug nuts, all the lug nuts on the rims should not be loose, should not be missing, and they're properly tight. Axle seal should have no cracks and no leaks, that all the bolts are properly tight and they're not missing. Now we come to the splash guards. Making sure the splash guards are not cracked or broken, they're not touching the ground, we're touching the tire, and they're properly mounted to the frame. Now we come to the coupling system. It's also a hook, or you can call it a pinto hook. Make sure it's not cracked or broken, that it's properly mounted to the frame. Checking the chain guards. Make sure they're not cracked or broken, they're properly mounted to the frame. If they ask you, what's this hook for? It's for your second trailer. Okay? Checking the lights. They should turn on and off. They're not cracked or broken. Properly mounted. Proper color is red and white. Also have reflector. They should not be cracked or broken, and the proper color is red. Okay, now we're done with the tractor. Now we come to the front of the trailer. Okay, now we come to the side of the trailer. We're checking for lights on top. We got no lights. We're checking for a door. We don't have a door. Just make sure the side, there's no damages, that the sheet metal's not hanging, that the rivets are not missing. Reflectors are not cracked or broken. Proper color is amber. Checking the frame of the trailer. No legal weldings and no cracks. Checking the rivets, make sure they're not cracked, broken, or missing. I also have rails. Making sure the rails, that the rails are not loose and they're not hanging, that they're properly mounted. Okay, I come to the landing gear. Make sure the landing gear is properly mounted, that all the bolts are properly tight. This is my crank arm. It should not be cracked, broken, or missing. I have a 2-speed, one that goes up and one that comes down. Checking the legs, no cracks, they should be well greased. The feet should have no debris and no damages. Okay, now we come to the rear of the trailer. Suspension, brakes, and tires, suspension, brakes, and tires. Okay, we do have a difference back here on the suspension. Okay, the suspension, like I said, we do have a difference back here. But you have to ask them to tell them, you know, ma'am or sir, may I tell you the difference on the suspension? If they say yes, well, go for it, tell them. The same way I check my rear suspension on the tractor, the same way I check it on the trailer. The only difference is that our suspension is welded. Suspension is welded. That should have no cracks. Also have a torque arm. Making sure the torque arm is not cracked or broken, properly mounted, that the bushings inside are not torn or missing. Okay, remember, if the examiner tells you no, that they want to hear everything, then you talk about everything. Then you talk about the spring mount, you talk about the torque arm, you talk about the bushing inside, you talk about the leaf spring, and you talk about the U-bolts. Trailer, remember, the trailer does not have an airbag or a shock absorber. Okay, so remember, you are allowed to ask the difference if you ask them. Okay, now we come to the brakes. Same thing. You would ask the examiner, may I tell you the difference on the brakes, ma'am or sir? If they say yes, okay. The same way I check my rear brakes on my tractor, same way I check them on the trailer. There is no difference. Also on the adjustment. Reason why? Because you got 2 brake hoses, 2 brake chambers. On the rear tractor, you have them back here on the rear trailer. 2 brake hoses, 2 brake chambers. Everything's the same. You have slack adjuster, push rod, brake drum, brake shoes. Same as the tractor. But if they ask you, I want to hear everything, then you talk about the hoses, you talk about the brake chambers, you talk about the slack adjuster, you talk about the push rod, you talk about the adjustment, you talk about the brake drum, and you talk about the brake shoes. Okay? So remember, the brake system on the rear trailer is the same as a tractor. There is no difference. Now we come to the tires. Okay, the tires, same thing. You may ask them, ma'am or sir, may I tell you the difference on the tires? If they say yes, well, the same way I check them on the rear tractor, I will check them on the trailer. There is no difference because you have everything the same over there. You have 2 tires, you have spacers, you have 2 rims, you have a valve stem, but the only difference is that you have a hub oil seal. And you tell them, the same way I check my front hub oil seal on the tractor, I will check it on the trailer. There is no difference. But if they have you talk about everything, you talk about the inflation, the condition, the depth, that these tires are permitted to be recapped. You talk about the spacers, about the debris. You talk about the 2 rims. You talk about the 2 valve stems. You talk about your lug nuts, and you talk about the hub oil seal. Okay, now when you're done here, then you come to the back of the trailer. Now we're back at the trailer. You want to start from your lights on top to the door and work yourself down. I'm going to check the lights on top, make sure they're not cracked or broken. Turn on and off, proper color is red. These are your commercial lights. Checking the door, making sure the door, that it opens and closes and it has no damages on the door. Come to the rear lights. Make sure they turn on and off, they're not cracked or broken. Proper color is red. Splash guards should not be touching the tire or touching the ground, that they're properly mounted. Come to the DOT bumper. It stands for Department of Transportation. We're making sure that it's not missing, that it's not cracked or broken, that it's properly mounted. Checking our airline connections. We're making sure that they're not cracked or broken, that the seals are not torn or leaking any air. Come to the pinto hook. You call it pinto hook, hook, or coupling system. And it's for your second trailer. Make sure it's not cracked or broken, that all the bolts are tight, that it's properly mounted to the frame, that the chain guard is not missing, that it's not cracked or broken, and it's properly mounted. Okay? Once you're done on the back of the trailer, then you come to the passenger side. You will stand right here, and you will let them know. By doing this, you will tell them, the same way I check the driver's side tractor trailer is the same way I check the passenger side. The only difference is that I have a door and an exhaust. Making sure that the door opens and closes, and there's no damages on my doors or hinges. Okay, we come to the exhaust. Make sure the exhaust has no exhaust leaks, that the exhaust is not damaged, that the brackets and bolts and exhaust are properly tight and mounted. Okay, that concludes your walk around. Remember, step by step, section per section, okay, and you will get this.